Hello, my name is Nathan Christensen. I'm a prospective educator with a bachelor's degree in history from UW. I also have a strong background in social sciences and in English. I've been coordinating with Tracy Lai this quarter for independent study, the culmination of which is this video. If I look back and forth a lot, it's because I have notes. It's not because I'm particularly shy, I just don't have everything memorized yet. Now, the goal of this video is to give you all some tips about composition, and more specifically about how better to use history to understand the social issue you're researching. Different parts of this video will be more or less useful to each of you, so for convenience, I've demarcated each subject every 4 minutes or so. The first section is called Strategies for Pre-Writing, and we'll start at this mark. How to draw conclusions from historical data is at this mark. The third section will be a historical background of Vietnam that hopefully enlightens you all on the people involved in that war and acts as a good example of how our perspectives may differ from those involved in actual events. That's at this mark. At this mark is a brief rebuttal of common misconceptions and overused cliches in history, things you probably shouldn't include in your paper. Lastly, at this mark, you'll hear strategies for strengthening your paper's main argument. Thank you so much for watching, and good luck with your papers. Anytime you sit down to write a paper, you have a certain approach. Any of the following 3 strategies can be a format for that approach, for just about any long written endeavor, but particularly they're applicable to research papers. These may be obvious, but hopefully there's a nugget for anybody in here. First, the web diagram. It's highly oriented towards visual learners, and is great for playing with the organization of your paper. Write your topic in the middle in big letters. Let's say, for example, you think the civil rights movement is actually very old and still ongoing, rather than a 1950s, 1960s thing. You would write in the middle the long civil rights movement, for example. Then, as I've illustrated here, this is a web diagram I use to plan this video. And here, take a good look, because I'll talk about what happens here rather than flipping back and forth pages. Okay. You'll branch off in other directions towards the ideas or points that support your main idea. This can be denoted either by writing the introductory sentence for the paragraph where you make this point, or just a phrase to keep things tidy and movable. You can make little notes underneath each bubble to help you keep track of what's going into each section. You can draw arrows into bubbles to remind yourself what you're going to need in order to support those ideas, what sources you're going to need. You can number the bubbles to show what order they go in. You can make smaller ones if you're going to have like the main idea be in the middle, then several paragraphs be denoted by one big bubble, and then each smaller bubble is a paragraph. You can do that too. Basically whatever you want. There's a lot of leeway in the web diagram. It doesn't have to look any one way to be useful. This particular way of pre-writing is nice because it's relatively organized, puts your whole paper on one page, is stimulating, and leaves lots of room to interject ideas and thoughts later. It also lets you put all your ideas together without needing to know exactly what order it's going to go in right away. It's a non-linear way of pre-writing, which is very different from the tried and true traditional outline, which is our next form of pre-writing. Most likely some of you have learned the outline in school as you had to write the 5-paragraph essay over and over, drilled into you every week for years. So many of you do know this already. For those who don't, or who are fuzzy on it or haven't used it in a while, it looks like this. Now, you don't need to have just 5 Roman numerals, especially in a big 10-page paper like this. I'll let you take a look. This isn't exactly the best outline. It's not a real one. So don't emulate the language too precisely. The reason there's more underneath letter 1 here is, well, for several reasons. I'll explain. Your first paragraph always has a hook, something to get the reader attached and drawn in. When I outline, I try to come up with the exact sentence and write it either on letter A or numeral 1. So the starter, like most outlines, the words are in note format, but you're better suited to have your intro paragraph in complete sentences. Respectively, you want to put your thesis statement underneath your hook. Write a strong thesis. Make it really clear and really concise so that when you come back and read it in a week, you still understand what the heck you were thinking. Just make it clear. Multiple sentences is okay. You can have a 2-sentence long thesis as long as it's going. Basically, your thesis is a box from which all the rest of your essay is going to come out. And as you're writing, you are going to be constantly reaching back into that box to put things down. Even 2 introductory paragraphs is actually okay too, when your paper is that long. I mean, if you're reading a novel, the introduction is even a chapter long. You're probably thinking, dude, tell us how to pre-write, not to write. But if you get your intro nailed down, it anchors the rest of your ideas, which you write sequentially in this format. Usually you use this when you are fine putting your ideas in whatever order. It's kind of hard to switch them around like this, especially if you don't leave room. But if you don't leave room, then it's harder to get it all on one page. So those are some of the drawbacks. It could just get too messy in a skeleton that's not supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be tight and organized. Next part. You can indent as many times as you want and get as detailed as you like under each capital letter. Basically get to the point where you feel comfortable going ahead with your rough draft, to where you feel like if you started writing your rough draft, you could just go on and not have to come back and come up with new ideas. This kind of pre-write may take more time, especially if you go into more detail, take more time than the web diagram, that is, or it can be constricting to the flow of ideas, but it has a neat structure and that gives you something to lean on. And as a finished pre-write, you'll likely be able to write the ensuing draft more quickly. Historically, the outline has been my go-to. However, I recently discovered another format, this is our third one, with an appeal to certain personalities. If you're a messy person, this next one's pretty good. It's very messy, in fact, but it makes the biggest possible pipeline of ideas between your brain and the page. Compositional theorist Peter Elbow champions what's called the free write. Basically, all you do is sit down and write. Doesn't matter what you start with, how fast you go, grammar, structure, organization, focus, forget about all that. Just put whatever comes to your mind on the page in whatever comfortable way the ideas flow. I want to interject here and say that this works better if you know more about your subject, or if you've thought about your subject before. I mean, if you have a research paper on Prussia and you haven't read about Prussia yet, then this pre-write is kind of pointless. But if it's about dredging your brain for all the ideas that you know are already in there, for stuff you know you've read about, and just putting it all together, this can be pretty nice. So the end result of this, of just writing, it's a stream of consciousness, is you get a big block of text. Now from there, it's just edit, add, remove, move, edit. It's just like writing a rough draft almost, except it's not designed to make any sense. It's not designed to have structure. You basically superimpose structure and grammar and structure and I said that twice, and everything on top of this free write. It's the same process as editing a rough draft, sort of, but there's just more to do. Now this will get pretty messy, but like I was saying, typing might be a better way to go with this, just because you can more easily move paragraphs around, delete stuff. Whatever your preference, though. It's designed to be a very customizable and personal way of writing, and to give you better access, again, to your thoughts, and just get things flowing. If you want to learn more about this kind of pre-writing, Peter Elbow puts it a lot more eloquently than I do, and it's a lot more involved, the theory part of it is, according to him. There should be a comment on the screen now with a link to an interview with Peter Elbow on YouTube. It's about 9 minutes long, pretty good stuff. To make the rest of this video a little more concise, I want to use a particular phrase, and I want to define it so that it makes sense to everybody. It's called doing history. Now, you might not think that your paper about a certain kind of activism, particularly if it's contemporary and if it's American, has much history in it, or that you will need to do very much historical research to talk about it and to make your thesis, to make your point. Consider this, though. Whenever you have two events and you refer to them together, and they happened between 15 or 50 years ago, and you're making one point with the both of them, you're using those two historical moments in tandem. You're relating them to each other. To do so, it puts them in a sequence, which puts them into a narrative or a story, which is basically what historians do. The Civil War is a bunch of events in a row, starting with the secession of South Carolina in 1860, and culminating in the surrender of Robert E. Lee in 1864, 1865. So, when you connect past events together in your writing as more than just an aside, you're doing history. Undoubtedly, you'll do this for your paper. To do it credibly, you have to be pretty careful. Usually, being careful just means using plain logic. For example, someone in their paper might say, well, America became a superpower because it won World War II. Those are actually non sequitur. They may seem causal, but they're not. So when you talk about history, you got to think about it first and ask yourself, okay, how do I know this? Does it really make sense? I want to give you a couple bad examples of doing history. Both of these are poorly drawn conclusions. When you're relating those two historical events and putting them into a narrative, they often add up to a certain thing. So I'll start off with bad examples of what I mean by that and give you a good one. So the first happened to me in a discussion group led by TA. There was a painting from the 16th century portraying a settler or explorer or some kind of clergyman meeting Native Americans as if they had just gotten off the boat and they were total strangers to each other. It was a really rich painting. There were a lot of trees and backgrounds, and their expressions were captured, and it was beautiful. And there were animals. One animal looked like a three-toed sloth. So a student in the class said, well, the painter reflected Europeans' negative attitudes towards Americans because the sloth on that tree suggests that they're lazy, like slovenly. So the only problem with saying that is sloths are a Latin American animal. The first settlers landed in North America, and the interior of South America hadn't really been explored yet. Not by Cortez, Pizarro, whoever, not by anybody. The animal sloth probably was not discovered yet, let alone inserted into standard English vocabulary. So how could that person's painting with that animal that looks like a sloth say that? I'm not even sure the artist was English, in which case the word sloth is completely moot. So make sure the statements in your paper make sense. Second story. Some historians of William Shakespeare, the ones who think he's a fake, that he didn't actually write all those plays that Francis Bacon did or whoever else did, say that the famous playwright never owned a book. And that's obviously evidence that he's not an actual playwright. Biographer Bill Bison tells us that their reasoning for this is that there isn't any evidence of him owning a book. By the same logic, Bison writes, Shakespeare never wore pants, because there's no direct evidence of him ever wearing pants. But facts lend themselves to both of these ideas, that he didn't wear pants and that he didn't own books, being false. You can infer those things. So the lesson in all this is this: when you present your own ideas, be able to answer, how do you know that? Similarly, when you present other historical facts as evidence, make sure they know what they're talking about. When you just cite a date, make sure your source is credible. In other words, don't steal some speculation off of somebody else's paper. This problem is usually avoided by basic non-plagiarism. So pardon me. So those are the two bad examples. Here's a good example of drawing historical conclusions, a good example. In reading about the empires involved in World War I, so you had Germany and the British Empire and the Russian Empire, a lot of the rhetoric involved the word nationalism. You might have remembered from history class that nationalism kind of led up to World War I. Leaders refer to their political entities or their countries as nations. Leaders from those same locales 200 years earlier did not use the word nation. Princes in Germany had no concept or use for nation, but the Kaiser did. So it turns out that no one in those areas in maybe 1700 or so thought of themselves as belonging to a group identified by its nationality. That wasn't really a concept. So we can conclude then that even though the contemporary leaders would talk about their nation going back hundreds of years, nations are basically intangible, somewhat contrived, man-made institutions, however tempting it might be to think of nation and country synonymously. So that's a conclusion, a sound conclusion that we drew. Leaders used the word nation later in time. They didn't, leaders from the same country backward in time did not use the word nation or the concept nationalism. Therefore, nationalism is a construct, an institution. That's a good way of drawing a historical conclusion. Doing history can be pretty hard to pull off if you don't have the knowledge of whatever background is relevant to your topic. It's just harder to make concrete sense of things. Basically, you might not know that my American World War II winning it made it a superpower. You might not know that there's not a causal relationship there. So that's kind of the hitch. But striving to do history better and to read more history will help you understand your topic more fully. It can also make your argument a lot stronger. Verification and fact-checking, again, is part of this, and it's important. I would also, that being said, I would advise not to get too bogged down in it. This section will deal with two common cliches used in conjunction with the study of history. For example, you might have been guilty at one point of saying to yourself that quote-unquote history is in the past. Why does it matter? It has nothing to do with me. One answer is that it matters to other people. In the legal system, the U.S. legal system, for example, precedents on past rulings often affect rulings today. If you're in court and a judge is deliberated and still isn't sure what to do, he's going to consult old rulings on similar events, on similar cases. So your fate is indirectly tied to whatever historical circumstances made old-timey judge say guilty or not guilty. People use history for practical ideas today, too. You can find inspiration for art, for business ventures, or even political slogans from different eras and even different cultures. History also tells our story. What I mean by that is that an understanding of human nature can be gleaned from any time period, from any place. It's evident in abundance everywhere. You may have thought that in 2000, for example, that you would never clamor for war in the Middle East, that you couldn't understand why people would decide to go to war. Well, this might not only might this have been proved wrong about yourself, it might you have surprised yourself after 9/11 and the terrorist attacks made, I think it was about 80% of the country clamor for military action, but other people in history have been in a similar position. The German populace under the Nazi regime, for example, after undergoing humiliation and economic downturn and looking for some kind of salvation, it basically indirectly led to the genocidal, totalitarian, ethically deplorable acts of that government. Those could not have happened if every day people, not unlike us, let it happen. So whatever revisionist judgment you make on people in the past can apply to you, because all humans have underlying tendencies, as evidenced by this demonstration. It's something to think about. Those are just a handful of ways that history is valuable. There are a lot more. No time to go into all of them. The past is not just the past, though. As for other cliches, a big bad one is the phrase, history repeats itself. First of all, that is untrue in its most literal sense. Unless you're Bill Murray and Punxsutawney Phil just popped out and said 6 more weeks of winter, which is neither here nor there, no 2 days, alpha to omega, are the same. Furthermore, every trend and tendency in history has an exception, denying the inevitability that this phrase implies. For example, every succession of power in a country, from the beginning of recorded history, has included some form of violence. So, whenever a king had someone beside his son or his direct descendant take over, there was violence involved. In 1796, John Adams succeeded President George Washington in a peaceful manner through popular election. That right there was the first time that violence had not been included in a succession, or in a lateral succession. That's bucking a very long historical trend and proving that history, in fact, does not repeat itself. That we are not doomed to make the same mistakes. On top of that, the phrase is just a cheesy catch-all to explain similarities across time. It's kind of a cop-out. It doesn't critically analyze anything, and it grossly oversimplifies the study. If history does appear repetitive in some way, there's a why. So show it. This phrase is also weak because it implies history is predictable. If it were, we would purposefully steer events our way. But the fact is that history has far too many variables for that to be practical at all. More variables than any physics equation. This section will be a lot easier to understand if you've watched the other section on how to draw historical conclusions from data, but that's by no means necessary. We're going to use the history of Vietnam, a topic with obvious relevancy to Vietnam War protests, to show you how to do history at a semi-amateur level and teach you about the Vietnamese. This is going to sound like a brief history lesson, so bear with me. According to Keith Schappa in his book East Asia, Identities and Change in the Modern World, and as corroborated in other texts, Vietnam shared a similar history and culture with China. If you're familiar with Confucianism and its effect on Chinese culture, or Chinese culture at all, a lot of that's going to apply to Vietnam as well. We're going to look at three major areas of cultural difference between Vietnam and Western civilization. The first is sense of time. We, as Western people, as American people, as Europeans, whatever, we look forward in time and see it as progressive and as a constant progression from a time of squalor and poverty and inconvenience and darkness, like forward to more and more lights. Forward is better, progressive is better. In the East Asian world, and in Vietnam included, they were more concerned with the past in that they were hearkening back to the halcyon days of a golden era, constantly striving for it, though, and trying to restore it, though knowing that that was probably not possible. Trumping the power, Keith Schappa writes, trumping the power of the past was that it was the domain of ancestors, who in this family-oriented culture were revered and honored. In other words, the respect that they had for their ancestors entrenched their value of the past. A Japanese political philosopher in the 18th century writes, even things that are profitable, if they are of a new form, are customarily to be considered troublesome, and for this reason, things that are traditional, even though containing slight elements of harm, for the most part should remain where they are. The second cultural aspect to look at is the sense of space. These tie together in that we consider the increase of space and the progression of space, and I don't mean like outer space, just space in a physical sense, as a good thing. So if you look at Manifest Destiny in U.S. history, where we assumed it was our destiny to go out and conquer the West and expand and fill up all the space, and that was a good thing. It was progress. In traditional Vietnamese culture, native place was a crucial part of family and individual identity. It was very much juxtaposed to expansionism, partly because the ancestors were tied to the land, partly because that golden era took place in that same area. Basically, East Asians, for most of their history, were not interested in going out. They valued where they were from. They had a lot of pride in that. The third aspect is basic social functioning. Rather than individuals being valued and prized and respected and known for their own achievements, persons were known by the quality of relations that located them within family and within communities. So they learned to prize relationships that were characterized by nurturance, dependency, and mutual obligation. This is out of Schappa's book. In other words, people were defined by their connections. This is a very Confucian element. On top of that was a hierarchy, often, that said that true equality was destabilizing and dangerous. An individual's bold and surging initiative, Schappa writes, would not only have been out of place, but also downright destructive of the social goals valued most, order and harmony. So as you read about interactions between U.S. soldiers and just any American in Vietnam and the Vietnamese, consider that the majority of them see the world in a drastically different way due to these cultural differences and other factors. That country, prior to the Vietnamese War, had also been subjected to decades of war, actually, which was in turn preceded by what can be accurately described as a violent, oppressive French colonial regime. In the 19th century, it sent a lot of missions and had a lot of commercial interests in that area, then known as Annam. In 1862, France forced the cession of certain counties from the government of Annam to the government of France, thus beginning the colonial era. The following decades culminated in France winning a war with China in which the latter relinquished all of its political leverage, i.e. the tributary system, over all its leverage over Annam to France. So that was basically the French colony of Vietnam as we know it. They had to put down a lot of revolutions and unrest in violent ways, including bombing in the 20th century. And from 1946 to 1954, which followed the Japanese occupation of Vietnam and the French Vichy regime, was the French War, which is a war for independence for the Vietnamese. They did gain that in 1954, but for the next decade there was intermittent civil war between factions. And in 1965, what's called the American War began in earnest. Now, it's reasonable to infer that these two parameters, the different Vietnamese worldview and the violent history leading up to the American-Vietnamese War, could combine to explain U.S. difficulties and even U.S. defeat in Vietnam. Stating this inference could strengthen some hypothetical paper's thesis. However, I will admit that without researching more on the subject, I personally could not make this inference into a conclusion. But if you wanted to support this idea for your paper, if you found many instances of native Vietnamese resisting to cooperate with Americans, if you found primary documents or whatever sources saying that had happened, or say if Nixon's report or some report from Nixon's administration acknowledged intercultural difficulties that affected the war effort, then that could be a reasonable conclusion. What I mean is, if you had some of those things, sorry for the paper, and you concluded that cultural differences in the preceding war made the American War harder for us, then that would be drawing a historical conclusion, and boom, you've tied together historical data to make a narrative. You've done history. And with such firm rhetoric, you've probably strengthened your paper as well. Before we start this section, I'll acknowledge that a lot of the advice I'm about to present wasn't followed in this video, mostly for the sake of brevity. And oftentimes in class papers, you'll have something brief, and it's hard to fit in all of the argumentative strategies you could. Those strategies are as follows. First off, there are a handful of argumentative strategies you should hopefully already be familiar with. Strong spelling, strong grammar, strong organization, and strong sentence fluency will not only keep your reader focused, but also make your words more legitimate on the whole. The actual logic of your argument has to be strong too, obviously. To test this, ask yourself, am I convinced of my own argument, or did I cut corners and miss certain points and leave holes to where I'm not even sure where I stand? If you're convinced and you feel convicted about what you've written, it's probably going to be at least somewhat persuasive. Furthermore, it's always good to include, then counter, the views that oppose your own argument in anticipation of the questions a reader might ask to challenge your opinion. In other words, argue the other side's point of view, and then counter, rebuff it. Aside from those, however, are tactics that deal mostly with how you use outside information. It's always ideal, especially when you're doing history, to use primary documents. A primary document is something like a journal entry or a video that it's an account of something that comes from a person who is as close to the actual event as possible. So these are the best forms of evidence to use in an argument, because mostly of the fact that the information you present hasn't been retold and told and retold, and thus possibly filtered through all those different sources. By the time it arrives on your paper, the reader will feel like they're getting it more straight from the source, and that's more convincing. In conjunction to the use of primary documents, a breadth of sources is also ideal. The more that other voices are in sync with yours, the more convincing your argument will be, however fallacious that may be in theory. Furthermore, it won't hurt in a 10-page paper to bombard the reader with a slew of supporting examples for one point. In David Montgomery's Dirt, it's a nonfiction book, his argument is that the Earth's soil is a resource whose exploitation and overuse seriously compromises societies that exploit or overuse that resource. It's most strengthened through the book. His argument is most strengthened by using example after example after example, almost ad nauseum, as to why this is so, and looking at societies that have done this and done similar things to cause overuse of the soil erosion, whatever. And his argument ends up very strong in the end. Using a breadth of sources and many examples will and should translate to many quoted passages in your paper. The hard part, once you've gotten to this point, is often balancing this plethora of quoted lines with your own thoughts. To counter this, never let a quote speak for itself. Always follow up a quote with your own thoughts that tie that quote into whatever your point for that paragraph or even for the whole paper is. For example, to use my previous imaginary paper about the civil rights movement, say it had a supporting idea in one paragraph of Martin Luther King Jr. harkened back to historical figures in reference to the civil rights movement. That paragraph might quote one of his friends saying about him, Harriet Tubman and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass were all people whose work Luther King was always trying to continue on or emulate. End quote. I would follow up immediately with my own thoughts, saying, this indicates that Martin Luther King Jr. saw himself as just the next of a number of historical figures fighting for civil rights. And then you'd move on or say something more. So again, you have a point already established, you have a quote in support of that point, but then by using your own words right after that, not only are you taking possession of that quote, you're incorporating it into your paper, and you're keeping the sentence fluency and just the entire flow of your paper and of your paragraph together. If you say something right after your quote that isn't in direct relation to it, it often feels non sequitur, and the reader isn't always sure what conclusion to draw.